The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Among those who went up to worship at the festival were some Greeks. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew. Then Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. The person who loves their life loses it, and the person who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor. Now my soul is troubled. And what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." The crowd standing there heard it and said that it was thunder. Others said, "An angel has spoken to him." Jesus answered, "This voice has come for your sake, not for mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die. The Gospel of the Lord.
Brothers and sisters, we have one full week left in our Lent before we begin Holy Week, the great week for next week following after Palm Sunday. And when we arrive at this stage, we always think how our Lent has gone, and even if it hasn't gone really, really well, this is the time just to say, leave all that behind and pick up wherever we are and make the best of this final week, and then to enter into Holy Week with a great and wonderful disposition for us to celebrate and to see Christ glorified. And even if we've had a good Lent so far, redouble our efforts and concentrate and focus even more so on this final week and the readings and preparation that is part of it, to persevere right to the end. Wonderful grace is there for us whenever that takes place. And compared to the Lent we all had last year, it's a great grace for us to have traveled and come together always these weeks and these Sundays and to celebrate with Christ in the church and with the Mass. And we think always, as we have, of those in Toronto who this will be their first Sunday to gather together. I think they just started on Monday, so we're very thankful for that, and throughout the country as well. Today, and this week coming up, will heighten, as we've seen very much, the contrast and, in a sense, the anger and the violence against Jesus, which will culminate in his death. And we reflected during the week very briefly that even though it seems that many forces are out there that are dictating what will take place in the episodes that we'll read in the Gospels, to keep in mind our hearts of the providence of God, that everything that takes place is ordained by God and allowed to take place by God. He's controlling everything, and he's giving his life for our sakes in love for our salvation. And the events that take place are the events that are his events. And the giving of his life, and no matter what way it takes place, and the suffering that is there is his glorification. And that's very important for us to keep in mind, that it's not a story of all kinds of things taking place. It's the things that God wished to take place for our salvation. And in these weeks, this reading from John is near the end. Certain people come to him at the festival, the Greeks probably from Alexandria, and say to those apostles who are of Greek name, "We'd like to see Jesus." And they take them to Jesus, and Jesus speaks this remarkable discourse that is given to us of so many components in it. One little component itself can be part of our prayer and our reflection. But it's that sentiment I just wish to begin with. They come to the festival, they know something about Jesus, and they go to those who can introduce Jesus to them, and they ask, "We'd like to see Jesus. Could you take us to him?" And that's a sentiment for us at this week, but also just before we begin our Holy Week, the week following, is to keep that sentiment in our hearts, to wish and to ask and to strive to see Jesus in this, to keep him in our hearts, keep him in the eyes of faith in the Gospels that we read, and to wish to be present where he is because he says, "If you are my disciple and servant will be where I am." And much of what we do in Holy Week is just to be with Christ as he goes through his own glorification in the crucifixion and resurrection that is part of God's will. That first sentiment is something that is in our hearts already, and to be aware of that in our hearts, of a desire to be with Jesus and to know him. Our first reading from one of the great prophets of the past speaks to us about the fact that even though the people have been brought from Egypt through the Red Sea, through a baptism of difficulty, and they've been given God's law by Moses on Sinai, something different now will be taking place. God will not write his law and the knowledge of himself on stone, but with his very finger he will write it on the hearts of his faithful. And think of the beauty of the sentiment of closeness that is. Everyone that God creates, and especially those in baptism recreated, will have God's love and the knowledge of God written in a covenant on their hearts with God's finger. And you can see that it's not one just based on law, but it's one based on a simile, but also on the love that the Father has. And this will be the new covenant. The old covenant, even as a covenant of a husband which was rejected, this is the one of one who gives his life. And when we ask, where is this seed coming from within us to desire to see Jesus? It's from this, in our baptism, in the way we've been created as the image of God, that there is something within us that desires to see Jesus, desires to be freed from the difficulties and struggles and sinfulness of our lives, but much more so to be present and to be seeing the one who is the answer itself. This is something to recognize within our hearts because it's the power of what God has put there already. We're seeing this time the wonders of migration of birds and of fish arriving at the same spot year after year, the same streams through the midst of the ocean, still being able to arrive through instinct at the right spot. In a similar way, but much more profoundly, God has put something within us that desires to be with him and to see him and to know him. And Jeremiah speaks of that covenant which every one of us baptized here has in a profound way, and that we share with all of humanity who is created in God's image. And when we're with Jesus, and when we go through this week together, then he begins to tell us of his glorification. And his glorification is that unless the seed dies, it cannot bear fruit. Jesus' death is a necessity in the will of God, and it is done out of love for us. And we can correspond, and the correspondence is there for us because of what he has already sown as a seed in our hearts, that we can see in his self-giving, that we can see in his sacrifice and love for us, the same kind of love that exists between husband and wife, between parents and children, between those who give their lives for others. And then, as we all know from experience, we're aware of that fulfillment that nothing else can give in life. And then that's very, very difficult, but paradoxical that we've spoken about so often, that unless this grain dies, unless it is broken apart and then grows again in a resurrection image, then we can't bear fruit as Jesus wishes us to. That confronts us with the necessity of death for every one of us in our lives that we've spoken about before. And as we go through this Easter season and this last difficult week before we begin Holy Week, the readings there that are confrontation between the authorities and Jesus, we begin to see that as we participate in this in our baptism, we participate in God's glorification. And Jesus speaks about that to his Father now. Father, glorify your Son. And the Father responds, you are already glorified, but the people who wish to see you will now see you glorified through the eyes of faith and your resurrection. And this is the destiny for all of us. This is the destiny in this last week that we prepare ourselves to celebrate, and as we've repeated week after week in this Lenten season, that we live in the Mass every time we celebrate, and that we live in the Easter we celebrate every year. And we grow closer to the mystery to allow that participation to overwhelm us, and that Christ lives within us, gives us the courage and the compassion and the love to follow him and be where he is as true servants.